This podcast was brought to you by a generous donation from the Public Servants Alliance of Canada and is produced in Algonquin, unceded, unsurrendered territory, otherwise known as Ottawa. Ani, bonjour. Welcome to Debwewin Speaking from the Heart podcast. The Sixties Scoop Network is a survivor-led Indigenous collective dedicated to healing, cultural reclamation, and community building for those impacted by the Sixties Scoop. Elaine Kicknosway ROxi Cardinal are co-founders since 2014 and have held 6 national gatherings bringing survivors from all over Canada, the United States, and overseas. These survivors were able to reconnect with culture and ceremony, share their lived experience through truth-telling, while raising awareness about the ongoing impacts of Indigenous child removal policies and supporting survivors on their journeys home. Debwewin Speaking from the Heart podcast is a space for truth-telling, lived experience, and healing conversations. Speaking from the Heart podcast is a space for truth-telling, lived experience, and healing conversation. Debwewin is an Anishnabek word meaning truth, and it was gifted to us by Algonquin elder Claudette Commanda. And today we are holding space for stories that speak to truth, loss, resilience, and reconnection. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that today's conversation touches on the 60s Scoop, forced adoption, and intergenerational trauma. We encourage listeners to take care of themselves and step away if needed. All right, so I am a 60s Scoop adoptee originally from Satellite Cree Nation and trafficked as an infant with my 2 older sisters to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, through the Canadian Child Welfare System. And I live in unceded Algonquin territory in the city called Ottawa.
Bonjour, and my name is Elaine Kicknosway, and I am a 60 Scoop survivor from the AIM, or Adopted Indian and Métis program. And my families come from Pelican, Deschambault, Amisk Lake, and Buffalo Narrows in northern Saskatchewan. And I'm a member of Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation. And I am very pleased to be here today. These were chosen from great considerations to what 60 Scoop survivors are speaking about and what we have heard and are responding to. Welcome to today's conversations. We're driving into some important and often sensitive questions about cultural authenticity, appropriation, inherent Indigenous rights, and our relationship with elders and knowledge keepers or carriers. These are complex topics, and the goal here is reflection, not prescription. Every nation, family, and communities carry its own teaching. And I want to introduce our guest today, who is unfortunate because he's not able to turn his camera on, but I'm very pleased to introduce our guest, Leroy Bennett, who is an elder and knowledge keeper from Sagamok First Nations and a Robinson-Huron Treaty elder. For over a decade, he has supported the 60 Scoop Network and survivors through national engagement sessions, cultural guidance, and ceremony, helping to create safe and grounded spaces for healing, learning, and reconnection. Leroy has provided consultation and ceremony from Amnesty International, Robinson-Huron Treaty litigation case, Robinson-Huron Wawinda Magawin, the National 60 Scoop Foundation, Argyle Communication Company, and for the community of Sagamok Anishnabek. His work is rooted in lived experience, respect for inherent rights, and a deep commitment to truth-telling and community care. Ani, Leroy, thank you for joining us.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for welcoming me here today to talk a little bit about the 60 Scoops. As you mentioned in a quick bio there, I've done quite a bit of work and look forward to continuing to do more work and to see how we can better help our people understand the thing they're looking to find, I guess. With that,
Mm-hmm.
I'll say me good for now.
All right.
Miigwech.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for joining us. So I just want to do a little bit of backpedaling and talk about, first of all, how we met. So I knew Leroy from Sault Ste. Marie and some work that we had done together at a group home and through college. I want to call it Algonquin College, Sioux College. And I just want to talk about how Leroy came to be involved in the 60s Scoop Network. And I knew that he was doing ceremony and doing good work that way for his community, but I had attended a couple of his sweats and knew that he carried ceremony and asked him what he knew about the 60s scoop. And I'll let him explain a little bit about how he came to know about the 60s scoop.
Hi, yeah. Um, for the actual 60 scoop, I really knew nothing.
Mm.
So it began a learning process with Colleen's help, or Roxy, sorry.
Thank
I
you.
knew.
That's okay.
So, and then I think one of the big things is trying to understand the concepts of how a government or an agency did what they did. I grew up on a reserve my whole life. Hunted, fished, trapped, did a little bit of trapping. But I grew up on the reserve, just thinking everything was the way it was. And until I met Roxy,
Hmm.
and the next thing you know, my learning took a whole different turn to
Yeah.
try to understand all of these different things. There was a little bit of work on everybody's part to sort of you know to get me to understand the 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 issues, the complexities, but more importantly, the how do we help people, the 60s group adoptees, find their way back to where they need to be. And
Hmm.
that would be their own roots, wherever they may have come from, and then be able to help them, figure out what needs to be navigated in their search for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So it was kind of a learning curve for you too, as it was for me, because I assumed that people who grew up on the res or that were indigenous or First Nations that they knew about the 60 scoop. But in my learning too, I had to understand that 60 scoop is more of an urban social white social work term that was just applied to us. And I just assumed that everybody knew that we were raised in white homes. And I remember you kind of saying to me one time, like, how can you grow up not knowing who you are or where you're from? And I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean? Like when you're raised with white people, you don't know, right? So um maybe we can talk a little bit more about like what is the 60 scoop called in your community? Like, did they talk about it at all?
Actually, no.
Hmm.
I don't know when it actually started. Maybe around the time I started getting involved with the Six Scoop in around that time frame,
Hmm.
about a decade ago. But it wasn't really something that was openly talked about.
Hmm.
It just knew, we just knew certain people were gone, and that was about the extent of it.
Hmm.
It wasn't until we went out west that I actually met some 60 Scoop survivors that were from my community,
Hmm.
and that made it interesting. So, as much as our community members were affected, we who were back on the reserve didn't know much and weren't really affected by this.
Hmm. Wow. Did you ever hear of like a family in the community or knew somebody who had children taken? And was there silence around that or was it not just talked about?
More or less, it just everybody knew there was family issues, but to what degree it was really never talked about.
Hmm.
And it's just sort of a hush hush thing, or you don't pay attention to that and carry on with your life.
Wow, eh? So there's been, some real learning curves in your community. Elaine, do you have anything to add?
Well, those different places of, like when I was coming back into community, there wasn't really conversations about cultural safety. So sometimes it was what they say, trial and error. And, I guess that's that conversation today is like, what's real when survivors or those that don't know are urbanized, or those that even have this concept of, I want to go to an elder or a knowledge carrier, and how do I recognize the authenticity, like keeping it authentic compared to appropriation? Like, do you have any advice? Because, sometimes I did put people on a pedestal, thinking, oh, they must be like really good, or because I saw like all these people going to them or flocking to them, so it gave me the impression that they were a safe elder and or a knowledge carrier, and then find out later actually they weren't, and kind of being bursting the bubble. So do you have
Mhm.
any advice of like what's real and what's appropriation?
I, I think a lot of it goes back to the individual, the wanting to be accepted, the wanting to be um, um, noticed as a person, as a First Nation person within the community, whether it's the First Nation or in the urban setting.
Mm.
That drives it almost like it drives a sense of inflation that you know somebody
Mm.
that's in the culture.
Hmm.
But when it comes to figuring out who's who and who's real, and the what and all these other things, that can become very complex. But one of the big things that you have to realize is that a good person or a good elder or a good knowledge keeper helps you figure out who you are. They do not create followers.
Mm.
That's how you can kind of tell the difference.
Mm.
Because either way you look at it, it's still a man, still a woman that are carrying the teachings, and it doesn't matter if it's a religion or a spiritual way. We're all human beings to that degree, and it makes sense then to understand that they're still capable of having issues, still capable of having problems. They're human beings. That's first and foremost, irregardless of the title.
Mhm.
So, and that's what makes it important. We may have good teachings, and there's lots of good teachings out there, but on the same note, there's also a lot of bad teachings. The people who get manipulated, the people who've been duped, the people who've also been, taken advantage of, whether it was financially, sexually, or to be part of the numbers game. What I mean by that is, oh, I have 50 followers. This person has 150 followers, and if you look on social media, they have 3,000 followers.
Mhm.
It's not humanly capable to deal with 3,000 people like that on a
Mm.
one-to-one to help you figure out who you are.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and it also becomes the ability then to distinguish and utilize a little bit of discernment,
Mhm.
because as part of it all goes, it becomes an important safety mechanism to realize. And through my own trial and error as well, if a person spends you know 10 minutes talking about a teaching and 50 minutes talking about themselves,
Mm.
there's a great imbalance there,
Mhm.
because they should be able to talk to you, decipher what you need to know, what needs to become, all these different things.
Mhm.
So it then you look at how one of the big things right now is how social media is really distorting that.
Mhm.
And in its own virtue, it could have been a good thing, but where it becomes a bad thing is when you remove the human interaction out of the teaching.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a computer as opposed to a human being, and then you're missing the connection,
Yeah.
which explains the disconnection.
Yeah.
And a lot of
Yeah.
people fall for it because they have somebody to listen to, they have somebody to look up to. So all of these things get completely exasperated or multiplied by 10 or 100,
Mhm.
and where they get sold on this idea that that person is infallible.
Mm.
but that's a human being, and they are subject to all the same laws, to all the same things that can go wrong in a life, whether relationship ends, whether it's whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the reality. And we need the pop bubbles in order to help people see the reality.
Mm.
Because
Oh, sorry.
if we look at it from a perspective of, if it's safety that you want, then you must look at reality, that individual could be an abuser.
Mm.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that.
I have a question. So, I wanted to share a little bit, so we've heard from many survivors who they're either scared to go to ceremony. I remember I was terrified to go into sweat lodge because nobody would tell me what would happen inside. And I was like, well, why can't we talk about that? Anyways, I was really scared of it. But we also have the other end of the spectrum where we have survivors that talk about how they've been harmed from certain elders or shamed or knowledge keepers. They've been chastised or yelled at or whatever. And then they kind of they don't want to go back because they're scared. And I want to help understand, what is it that we can do to help survivors feel more, or what could you tell knowledge keepers and elders out there that makes a difference in making folks feel safe when they come to ceremony space?
I think it all goes back to one thing.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to the knowledge keeper or the elder understanding that person is starting, for lack of a better word, starting from the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So we help people understand that this is what you need to come to learn about who you are as a person. But more importantly, there is a level of misunderstanding out there. There's still sort of a hidden shame, if you will, that perpetuates this issue of the shaming. It perpetuates the issue of people not wanting to go back, but it also fuels the urgency of divulging that they're a 60 scoop, but too quickly though.
Mm.
So then it becomes a weapon of shame.
Mm.
And these individuals, the 60 scoop survivors, don't know what to do with that.
Mm.
And with that being said, then comes the person's ability to, look at and say, okay, this person's safe or not safe. But they also have to be discerning enough to say, that person might be great for you, but they're not good for me.
Mm.
Because if it goes back to creating safety, then what exactly are we going to create safety for?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one is, no physical harm comes of any kind, no financial harm comes of any kind. But the reality is, there's so many pretend Indians out there. There's so many fake people out there. There's so many people who want to create followers out there. There's so many people that want recognition at any cost.
Mm.
So it's unfortunate then a lot of people don't recognize that shame becomes a language within the ceremony.
Mm.
Right? And the shame itself then becomes the identity. And with that identity comes all the issues.
Mm.
So with that being said, then it's kind of interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's almost like a little child being scolded. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And they behave accordingly to that.
Mm-hmm.
And when they behave accordingly, they're not either the conductor, the knowledge keeper, or the elder are not understanding that the individual suffers a disconnection from this stuff. So it also then perpetuates this lack of nurturing in what culture actually means, as opposed to somebody wanting followers or somebody looking to be right or somebody looking to be strict. It becomes a like a volleyball game. You know, you
Mm,
hit it over and everybody wants to look good and, you know, all the stuff and the team looks coordinated. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how coordinated you look. If somebody's suffering shame because of what those people did, then it's not good.
mm-hmm. When you were learning, when you were, you started this life to walk this life, were any like your teachers, were any of them like, did you find them harsh? Did you find sometimes like, because I remember we had a conversation before that sometimes, your teachers were, um, I mean, even Elaine, I think too, has shared that too about like, there's a level, right, of nurturing, and then there's a level of shame, right? Where they're doing it in front of other people to make you look bad, or they're trying to teach you, genuinely trying to teach you in
Yeah.
correct behavior. Yeah. So
I
was
think
it, go ahead.
I think a lot of it goes back to one thing. Every so often, what my teachers have told me is when they realize that the student comes along,
Hmm.
and that creates a different dynamic as opposed to somebody just listening to the teaching.
Hmm.
So with that different dynamic comes a different level of strictness, a different
Hmm.
level of understanding, a different level of, you know, doing things in a manner that would perpetuate the kindness all the time.
Hmm.
Now, keeping in mind though, one thing, there's also another dynamic, where you have people who are either angry, maybe full of shame, maybe they're just bitter. So they come to challenge that particular knowledge. They come to challenge it because they want to be right. They're the ones who know best on
Hmm.
whatever the rationale might be. But it goes without saying though, you know, a teacher can also become a student at the same moment,
Hmm.
especially when that type of interaction happens.
Right.
And the ones who fail to recognize that lesson sometimes are not, they may have really good teachings, but the attitude, the submission techniques start to show. And
Hmm.
if the student learning from that, they do then become the teacher as well.
Mm. Okay. That makes sense. Right?
Hmm.
Yeah, because I was sharing with Colleen, a lot of my teachers in the 90s were all residential school survivors. So they would just like yell at me. And when I was coming home and going to these various, events or ceremonies, I was just like, oh, I guess that's how I'm taught. I just get yelled at when I come home.
Oh my goodness.
Um, And that goes into like what are inherent rights that adoptees may not know, like when I was over here and joining into the Indigenous community or the organizations, that was the first time I started hearing about spirit names, right? And I was like, oh, what's that? And the different circles that I'd go to, like they'd pass the feather or stuff like that. And I was like, or even smudging. Like I didn't like being raised out west, I didn't see smudging until I learned it at the organizations here in the city. So I was like, maybe smudging's just for the city. Like, so I guess like that's that place of like what like it's that gentle reminder, like what are our inherent rights? And like do you know like what the inherent rights of Indigenous life is, because I know some of it is, right to your family, right to your land, right to your name, but there's more there.
Yeah, I I do think you touched on a lot of good points, but when we talk about Anishinaabe, we always say Anishinaabe Nodzu, and what's my name?
Mm-hmm.
I don't usually go with spirit name
Mm,
because it's almost like a modern flavor to that.
okay.
Because when we talk about everything in the land, everything has a name,
Mm-hmm.
but it also has that spirit within that within that, right? And I think a lot of it goes back to, um, if you were meant to be, say, a ceremony conductor, there's a different level of strictness that goes with that. But if you're only a participant, there is a different level of kindness that should be with that. Because a lot of people don't recognize it has to happen in a manner where everything flows, just like a river. It just has to flow just like a river. And that's how it's meant to be. However, again, right, we have the residential school stuff, and people are strict, and sometimes they don't even know why, but a lot of it is just based on memory. You know, the body remembers, even though the mind they may think they forgot it, but the regiment is there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the student also has to take that into consideration. You know, maybe he has a bad day because he's a human being too.
Yeah.
So we have all these inflated stereotypes of what a healer or what a ceremony person should do. And sometimes those inflated things is what creates all the issues. Because there's a miscommunication or a complete disconnect to the reality. And one of the things I always hear is, oh, this is how they did it over there. And I always tell people that's fine. But while you're here, you'll do it the way we do it here.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing right or wrong about it. But if that person keeps persisting, then they're making it wrong. Right. And again, that message is not to be taken lightly where anybody can make stuff up and then go do as they please or enforce themselves on the people.
Yeah.
What it is meant to help people understand is it's like looking at a coin. There's two sides to that thing. It's not just one. Because we'd be very one-dimensional if that was the case.
Yeah.
When we talk about like knowledge carriers or people kind of taking on that appropriating stories or making up these grand stories, as somebody who's learning, I look at it and I question it all the time. And do you think like we have a responsibility as learners to ask where that knowledge comes from if they don't share it? Like, do you do that in your practice?
Yeah, I do. I let people tell who taught me. You know, I've had different teachers at different level of strictness and all these other things, because it prevents the veil of somebody saying the elder and using a false sense of authority to keep a fabricated lie going. You know, at one time I would have said, no, you got to go learn this at ceremony. And I still believe in that. However, because, you know, with the way things are going today, I find that you still have to go into ceremony to hear what's going on, but you still also have to keep in mind that sometimes the truth of certain things. So what I'm going to get at is this. If somebody tells you a very grand story and it sounds beyond amazing, be cautious, because a lot of our stories should revolve around us as human beings. Right? Because that's all we are. We're just human beings. As simple as that sounds, there are some that want to be grander than that. So they have to make up stories. They have to do things in such an elaborate way. Or the other way they do it is that they treat, say, somebody who doesn't know the ceremony, they like that person for whatever reason. It could be money, it could be whatever, for sex, you name it. And they give that person special privilege. Right? They give them special privilege to get them or to entice them into their little trap. Because when I learned growing up in ceremonies and all this stuff here, growing into what I, became later in life, it was a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And that's the interesting thing about it, right? So, but back to my earlier point, you have to be cautious about that special privilege. Because that doesn't seem like nothing wrong with it. I'll give it that. But it comes with hooks. And those hooks are not usually shown till after.
Oh, okay. I could see that. I could see, a lot of survivors who are thirsty for knowledge being kind of almost, what do they call that? Groomed or,
Hmm.
you know, taken under somebody's wing and then
Hmm.
taken advantage of or used for something else, you know. And then they never go back to ceremony and they turn their back to it
Yeah.
and yeah.
And you nailed it right on the head because you shouldn't get wounded in ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
You've already, 60 Scoop survivors already, had that disconnect from family, but through the negligent actions of others, they face a deeper disconnect
Mm-hmm.
or a deeper form of shaming, which is a harder one to work with. But at the same time, too, it's also as difficult as it is, it's also a good teaching tool, right? To have that awareness to say, this is, and I guess you can say the shady people, I'll put it that way, all
Mm-hmm.
behave roughly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly the same way, just because it takes those tactics, you know, an X amount of years to learn, but they've learned them. And so now they use them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what happens. So, but back to the other thing, and that's why 60 Scoop survivors struggle to figure that out. They kind of, I speak of it easily, but I know it's difficult, but they have to look past the shame at that person for what they are,
Mm-hmm.
not what their mind creates.
It's true. Sometimes we have things that kind of are like almost like rose-colored glasses, right? And it's usually from childhood trauma. So we don't see that person for the behaviors or for the narcissist or predatory behavior that they are. Instead, we say, oh, they're so ceremonial and they're so traditional and la la la. And then they get caught up in that. And I could see that happening easily to a lot of people. I think like when Elaine and I started doing this work, we were really careful about who we brought around survivors. And, we've had people suggested to us and this and that. And we always look at actions and we listen to the community of who is doing good work out there and how they include certain people in certain ceremonies and their language that they use. Um, so they're not shaming people who've done sex work or who've done time in jail or used drugs or, because 60 Scoop survivors, we've been through it and some of us are still going through it, right? So we're still really struggling and we're very raw when we come to ceremony because sometimes we don't even want to be there, but we're going to try it. And all we're listening for is something to tell us that we don't belong there. And if we hear it, we hear, oh, you do sex work. You're not a good person, or women who do that should be ashamed of themselves. We're listening for those kind of things. And so we're really careful about who we bring around in ceremony. And we did have somebody who was recommended to us who came out to our very first gathering and said to the survivors in that room, oh, I would have never let them take my children. I would have never. So then, of course, like we all sit there thinking, like, well, why didn't our parents fight for us? You know, it,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
it instantly caused this shame and this anger and this, like people were really affected by it. So we never asked that person back, but we have to have conversations with people, especially when we're doing this work and we're like across the country, I think like as people who are holding space for vulnerable populations, um, we have a responsibility to make sure that this safety that we create for survivors who've been through it, you name it, from sexual abuse to spiritual abuse to everything, we are responsible for making sure that we have responsible people coming to do that, knowledgeable people coming to do this work who carry ceremony in a good way, who have good teachings, and those are very hard to find. I think I have a handful in my one hand that I know. So, so we're very fortunate to have you be a part of this. And I just want to talk a little bit about what barriers you think 60 Scoop, like in your community, um, what barriers do you feel like you had to overcome, people in your community have to overcome about urban 60 Scoop survivors who live in big cities compared to living in rural communities? So, um, when we go back to community, like I know when you come to the city, you always get really overwhelmed by the traffic and the speed and stuff like that. And when we come back to our communities, to rural communities, we're like these city kids. Do you think like your community and the people in your community, do you think there's a barrier to them learning about 60 Scoop survivors?
Well, I'm not sure if I would technically call it a barrier until, you bring somebody that legitimately is a 60 scoop survivor to
Mm-hmm.
talk in its rawest form about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then you quickly begin to understand, and I think this applies to any, not just my community, but every community. I think it applies to all of where you, I don't want to say weed out, but that's what'll happen. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to trigger people, and are they able to handle these triggers to deal with what, maybe that's out of their spectrum of control or knowledge, and then to logically fight with these concepts.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it always goes back to one thing. It's going to trigger old feelings from whatever age it was, whether it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. And those are unmet needs, but also misunderstood needs, but also needs that need to be addressed as
Mm-hmm.
to answering the why. Because our minds as human beings, we love to struggle with why. We
Mm-hmm.
just love to struggle with it. And our minds don't rest until we get an answer, whatever that answer might be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people have to recognize that there's a lot of whys, but somebody who's not trained in this or is aware of it are not capable of giving that why. And I think that's where the barrier, if you want to look at it that way, that's where the barrier would lie. We
Mm-hmm.
could have all the greatest intentions, but the reality is that sometimes good intentions can cause horrible results.
Oh,
Re-traumatization
we
is
know
one of
it,
them.
right?
Yeah, re-traumatization, new traumas, because it's unfortunate, but then the ignorances start to show. Sometimes it is a lack of knowledge, and sometimes it is feelings that it brings back up.
Yeah. And you're talking about the community, right? Like when the
Yeah.
survivor comes home.
Hmm.
Have you seen survivors come back to your community? Have they done any ceremonies for them or anything?
Actually, not as of late. And if there was, I wasn't aware.
Mm-hmm.
But we are trying to host something down the road, if it's possible, to see where that's going to happen. And my biggest concern are we ready? I don't want to end us opening up a can of worms and not closing it.
Yeah, it's true. Like it's almost like Canada-wide, like First Nation communities need to do some healing to get to the point where they can talk about 60 Scoop survivors come home. Like we're getting older, right? We're
Yeah.
not gonna be alive forever. So and we talked about that yesterday with the New Zealand survivor when he came home and he's like, it's so important that our stories are shared because we're getting older,
Yeah.
and they're not documenting our stories. So I think that is my next mission. But Elaine, do you want to have anything to add?
Well, as we're coming home, sometimes, that importance of identity and recognizing, our two-spirit or our trans gendered folks and relatives and survivors. How are we supporting them in ceremony practices or, even the calling in? Like, are we, it's that meeting the need, right? And how have you been able to do that yourself, Leroy?
Well, coming from the country, that's a little bit more difficult to do,
Mm,
only because I don't think it's widely accepted in the smaller communities.
Mm-hmm.
But in the urban communities, there's a bigger difference. And what I've noticed is that people are more open to it.
Mm-hmm.
The diversity is there. But at the same time, too, we also have to keep in mind that in doing the ceremonies, whoever that person might be, you kind of have to follow the instructions of what that ceremony is and not force it to happen. So you don't want to create like a ceremonial battleground. Maybe that's a bad way of putting it, but that's what it turns into. Um, of one trying to be right, the other one trying to follow his original instructions. And we can't play politics with this because now you're playing with spirituality, you're playing with the ceremonies. And some of those older people don't like that because it reminds them of what they had to endure from the church. You know, it wasn't that long ago, even into the 80s, they were still burning sweat lodges down. So it's
Yep.
still a living memory.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes in forceful, you trigger that.
Mm-hmm.
You automatically trigger that. So it's being able to understand, first of all, how that tobacco works in ceremony. And if they don't know those teachings, you need to sit down and listen to that. And usually most ceremony people will talk about that in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you come with rights as opposed to an understanding, you've already created the battleground.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the understanding that alleviates the battle. Right. But with social media, the moment one person does something wrong, they get jumped on.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is also an element of truth, but who's actually telling the truth, right? That's where we need to be discerning about that. But in its own right, though, I think a lot of times that's what needs to happen is that it needs to be told from a level of humanness, not a level of rights. And that would probably solve a lot of problems.
All right. So say you have somebody who identifies as a two-spirit person. Is there a teaching in the lodge where they have to sit? I know
Um,
I went to like a ceremony in Saddle Lake with the late Vince Steinhauer, and he sat them at the door. I think he sat them at the door.
Western doorway.
The one you come in on.
Oh, Eastern doorway.
He sat them at the eastern doorway, and they were two-spirit in transition to from male to female, I believe. And that's where he sat them. And I was just like, I never knew anything about it. Like you don't know, right? Unless you're
Yep.
like you're around folks who and they that was where they had placed them. So I know like I don't want to get political either, but I do know that folks who we've had several LGBTQ come to our gathering and their first thing is, do I have to wear a skirt? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? Because I've never wore a skirt in my life. If they're a woman or if they're a two-spirit person, but they identify as non-binary, right? So
Mhm.
but I think like it's a lot stricter out west too. I feel like it's a lot stricter when, if you are the ceremonies out west are a lot stricter.
Yeah. I think it goes down to the individual. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by the individual who's doing the ceremony,
Mm.
it goes down to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't speak for them,
Yeah.
but on the same note as well, right? I think you need to have a conversation prior to the actual ceremony beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Then you'll get a better idea. But if you walk in with assumptions and fears, you're gonna, for lack of a better phrase, you're gonna reap what you sow,
Mm.
right? Because if it's all based on energy, then a lot of what we do, the energy you send out is the energy you receive.
I get that. Well, I mean, I think maybe it's harder for somebody who's been around ceremony all the time, who just this is their way of life, this is everything they know, and to
Hmm.
have somebody come in who's been completely assimilated who's been maybe even told that these ceremonies they're devil worshiping, they're paganist or whatever, whatever whatever these families taught them, right? So it's harder to bring them back into those spaces. Some of them are very resistant to it, but they're curious, right? And that fear is real, like it's a real thing, like and if we don't talk about it, we don't talk about what to expect, and we don't prepare folks um, for these, even the simplest passing of tobacco, why we pass tobacco, why we need to have these conversations with our elder or our person who's running ceremony. Like, I think that's a great place to start because like I went into it not knowing nothing. Like, I actually thought I would get high from smudging. And I also believe that, there's so many things that I didn't know that I learned a very hard way. And I think a lot of survivors are coming from that mindset, and that fear is real. So trying to alleviate those fears. And also, this conversation is about how do we work with, how do other knowledge keepers and ceremony conductors and elders, what could you tell them to help them understand why so many of us don't come back to ceremony, or so many are hesitant about ceremony?
Well, I think it all boils back to a few things. One, and this kind of goes on both sides, right? And what I mean by that, the knowledge keeper or the ceremony person may not have no knowledge about 60 Scoop, may not have no knowledge about Two Spirited. So based on that one singular assumption, we can't force it, we can't do it, but we can go in a respectful way they can go with their tobacco in hand and talk first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The same thing goes the other way. Maybe the ceremony maker needs to pass tobacco to that person to say, talk to me about something, tell me about this. And then that's how you start the dialogue. But for some of the fears that happen, I mean, I get it. A lot of it went back to the church. They said devil worshiping and et cetera and all this other stuff. Because one thing I've come to understand about all of this, even in the beginning, 1492, when they showed up, on our shores and they started moving this way, one of the biggest things that I've come to realize, and our way of life is beautiful. And any abuser, shyster, anybody like that will try to destroy what is beautiful because they can't have it. Right? They can't have it. And just like an abuser, they can't have it. They're going to destroy it. But to offer you the world's greatest excuse why. Hence the devil worshiping. Hence the paganism. Hence all these other things. And that's why, if you look at their lifestyle speaks volumes of other things. Then you include the doctrine of discovery, killing us all. That's not a beautiful way of life. That is something totally different.
True.
And so when now you apply that to different individuals, fast forward to our time, the behavior is still exactly the same, but they might just have brown skin in this case. Right? And so what comes out of that then is that you'll find very similar behaviors. What the church did, their philosophies, you'll find that very similar thing in that person, even though they're brown. And it makes it difficult because the first thing they tell you is you got to respect your elders. Doesn't matter if they're abusive or not, you still got to respect them. That sounds very church-like to me.
Yeah.
So the hard conversation is to decipher these things, point them out and say, this is the issue, this is the problem, and this is how we're going to deal with it. The same thing. If you go now, you say it's a knowledge keeper or ceremony maker, you got to respect them. Even if they hurt you, you still got to respect them. Which puts the person in an absolute conflict with themselves, but it also puts them in conflict with the teachings.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I could see that.
Yeah. So when that happens, then it's no longer about the teaching or the ceremony. It's about what's really going on, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So for all we know, we don't know if it's abuse. We don't know till the person talks about it that all of these things happen.
Hmm.
But it's like everything else. There's a history of denialism, what the church has done. They've apologized, but apology means nothing, especially if you're still hurting from if the peoples are still hurting from it. An
Hmm.
apology never got anywhere or won't get anywhere.
Yeah.
So the other thing too then is becomes, how do you help somebody who is stuck in disbelief and now shame? That's a hard one,
Hmm.
right? Because not only did they get it from the non-natives, the settlers, they now got it from their own people. So
Yeah.
you got a double shame effect, a double disbelief effect. You also have probably, a lot of other things that are enmeshed in all of this stuff, and that's why it takes a while to work at that. It's not something that's not going to be done, and definitely a smudge in this case won't help because it takes a human interaction to make that healing begin.
Hmm.
You can't really find that online.
No.
No.
One last
And that's
question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just talking or thinking about, as you were talking about, the really importance of visiting and communication and bringing forward, taking care of your own stuff, right? While you're trying to develop and grow into spaces of loss and then handling your own space, whether it's through speaking with friends or a counselor or ceremonial peoples, and navigating how do I continually not wear this shame blanket or not or the missing out or the things that I didn't have and how do I grow into being compassionate to um, celebrate the fact that I am now. And it's that balancing, right? And that place of what you were talking about with, sitting and giving the opportunity to say, I'm going to go sit and maybe I don't know everything. Um, and maybe I'm in that place of knowing I know some answers, but I don't have to know all the answers. And maybe even that elder or that traditional person doesn't know the answer either. So it's like that they do the work too. Like they're to continue to grow of community care and learning about what else we need to learn about community because of this longevity of generational silencing because there was silencing from the children who went to residential school and they only started talking about it in the 80s and the 90s and then now there's the conversation of the children who went to or was in the child welfare and now there's conversation of Indian hospitals and day schools like we're just I don't know if we're going to completely catch up or the the openness of having our two-spirit and trans folks within within ceremonial practicing to capture it all like how do we capture it so that we're still loving and kind and honest and brave and like so respectful and yeah, I just wanted to add that. I thank you for all of the conversations you've been sharing with us, and I just I know it's an ongoing learning curve for many of us, and for even as I'm learning and unlearning, even unlearning. So thank you
Mhm.
for that, Leroy.
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you.
I have one more question. And I just, because it relates to us and what you've worked with us for so long, you kind of like, you've been through, like, you've helped deliver training with us and you've learned like the mindset of, some of the folks that are doing frontline work out there still don't know about the 60s Scoop and their First Nation helpers. So do you think that folks who are raised with culture in the communities might hold some stereotypes to those who didn't grow up with culture and ceremony?
I would say they hold a little more than just a stereotype.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is probably also fear,
Mm.
because sometimes fear drives insecurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people would have to look within themselves to figure out how that's going to, work, or a solution to be generated for that. And I also think that the other one of the key ingredients in all of that, again, circling back to the cultural safety, is to actually know what is a safe person,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because some people are very good. However, what some of the 60 scoop survivors might find, and then through their negative experiences, is that they weaponize charm,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they don't see the weapon until whether it's the elder, whether it's the ceremony maker, or whether it's the what do you call, an individual would have a source of authority. Once they disprove of that, then they see the weapon. It's not till that moment that they see that. So again, right, it reinforces disbelief in ceremony. It reinforces that they're not good people out there. It reinforces that, the shame they carry is right.
Mm-hmm.
And insecurity that drives that sometimes is right. So it becomes like a triple effect now, where people are like, okay, I knew this was going to happen. However, with that being said, one of the big things too, then, that comes out of all of that is that stepping into unknowns really drives fear and insecurities. So it's already there anyway.
True.
And I think that's where people have to recognize that this is what I'm feeling, despite not being there at the ceremony until I get to the ceremony. You have that maybe an hour, half an hour, or whatever the time frame to process that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go from there. So maybe now you're finally in ceremony, and you get to hear people who actually talk about things, as opposed to somebody who's complaining about things. There is a
Mm-hmm.
difference. There's a world of difference there.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get into the healing circles, it's not so much about condemning people. It's more focused on what's going on with me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's the whole issue. Not so, I shouldn't say issue, but the whole point of the healing circles, you talk about what's going on with you.
Right.
We can condemn somebody for the next 20 years and still be in the same spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people need to recognize that's again, it also goes back to one other thing. Who am I without my shame?
Whoa, now you're dropping some deep stuff. Who am I without my shame?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Who am I without my insecurity?
Jeez. All right, you're gonna wrap things up.
That's a good one. I like that. I really like that. It's like saying, if I had no fear, what would I say?
Hmm.
Or where would I go? Who would I be?
It's
Where would
true,
I
right?
where would I be going?
That kind of talk keeps me up at nighttime because
Mm,
there's so many things that I am afraid to do, and because I don't know, because I'm afraid, and I just one of our knowledge keepers for my workplace dropped that question and said, "What would you do? What would you be capable of doing if you had no fear?" I'm like,
mm,
holy cripes! Like, what's holding me back? You know? So that's pretty deep too. So
Yep.
who am I without my shame?
the
Yeah,
continued conversation.
exactly. I love that. Thank you for dropping the knowledge.
No
All
problem.
right. So keeping safe and we dropped some really good knowledge today and talking about issues that we struggle with all the time as 60 Scoop survivors, but not just 60 Scoop survivors, all Indigenous people who have not grown up around ceremony or disconnected from community and so on. So when we're coming to those spaces, we always come with trepidation, right? Like,
Mhm.
what's going to happen? Um, and I think like Elaine and I also, when we started doing the the 60 scoop gatherings, we were really careful about predators, right? We didn't want people coming that were there to pick up or, like, because we know that happens. We know that, those spaces are notorious for, you know, whether it's a man or woman coming to find a new date or find a new woman or find a new man or whatever it is that folks do. And sometimes that happens, but we didn't want that in our space where we had, people coming there to just hook up. It's not an AA meeting, just kidding. But because we know that happens there too.
Oh yeah.
But, so those are super important because we want survivors to continue to come to ceremony, to come out and join the community and but do it in a safe way.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Shimigoi, for trusting us and sharing your truth and your knowledge and being here uh, in your presence off camera. Um, To all our listeners, thank you for listening with open hearts. And may we continue to walk forward with truth, compassion, and responsibility. Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah.
Miigwech and miigwech for having me.
Yes,
Me,
Have a
thank
good
you.
evening.
care.